So for anyone who just joined, I think a lot of people kind of hopped on in the last few minutes. Welcome to our very first DC Arts Community Day online. We have been chatting with some amazing artists and organizations, and we'll be online up until 5 o'clock today. So we're super grateful that you could join us. So I'm going to move right along, and I'm really happy to introduce one of my favorite people and collaborators, Alison Nance. She is the gallery director at International Arts and Artists at Hillyer right here in DC. Hillyer is committed to supporting artists at all stages of their careers. They present a series of exhibitions and programs that feature local, regional, and international artists. Hillyer was founded in 2006 and continues to provide significant support to local and international artists, as well as presenting programs that reach broad audiences and create platforms for dialogue. Alison has been working on a great series of online programs featuring artists from around the globe. And I should mention that they're a wonderful cornerstone in the First Friday arts programming in DuPont. So really looking forward to eventually getting back on that schedule. And today she's going to focus on an awesome local artist, Eric Hillyer. So over to you, Alison and Eric.
Hold on. Hello? Is it working?
Working.
Yeah?
Yeah, I can see you.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. I couldn't see anybody for a minute. Hi, everybody. I'm, as Nicole said, Alison Nance. I'm the director at Hillyer, and it's great to see so many familiar faces, and I just want to thank Halcyon's team for making this possible. We've had a lot of individual programs that we've all been doing, and I've loved being on all these. Maybe too many, but it's been really amazing to connect on Zoom for lots of calls, but it's nice to see everybody together in one space. That's something I personally miss, is just like casually running into everybody at openings and talks and things like that. So thank you everybody for organizing this. So as Nicole said, we're doing a virtual studio visit with Eric Hillyer, who had his first solo show with us at Hillyer almost a year ago, so May 2019. And you can probably see from his amazing background, he's an incredible painter, but I was thinking about Eric at his opening was wearing this like really amazing blue suit, I think with like a floral shirt, very hip glasses, white tennis shoes. It had like a really perfect West Coast vibe that was perfect with your palette and some of the content in your work. So I thought it would be like a good jumping off point to talk about your kind of transition from West Coast to Austin to DC and that kind of story and what brought you here.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you everyone for having us. I really appreciate the opportunity. Alison has been a huge proponent for me, and I can't thank her enough for thinking of me for opportunities like this. But yeah, it was quite the journey getting to DC. So I was born in Chicago, but grew up in Southern California, left California when I was a teenager, moved to Texas with my family, and then about 10 years ago, decided it was time to get out of Austin and move to DC. So moving to Texas wasn't by choice. That was more of a economics and family situation. But I deeply enjoyed my time in Texas. But part of what's always stuck with me is this idea of like the mythology of California and my roots there. And when I moved to DC, it was for something not necessarily related to my art, but related to my other aspects of my professional creativity as a creative director and wanting to live someplace that was different. I had an impression of DC as being both a highly historical city, obviously, but also a city with its own art scene and arts community. And I think, Austin is a great town, but by a lot of measures, it's a small town and doesn't have a lot of galleries. And I felt that DC was someplace that would be, just provide me with more opportunities and more exposure to new opportunities, and different people, a different culture, a different speed. I will say that when I got here 10 years ago, I think I was maybe a little bit more optimistic about where the trajectory of the gallery scene here was going. It's great to see that there are new organizations, starting up within the last few years, and galleries starting, I think. Organizations like Stable have been really exciting to watch. But there's also been a lot of players that have been here for a long time, like where my studio is, 52 O Street, that have provided spaces for a long time. So, Austin as a scene was a little bit insular. And I think the impression I had of DC, especially from friends of mine like Kristen Capps, who's an amazing arts writer and a fellow University of Texas alumnus, was that, you know, there was just energy here. There was stuff going on. There were people here that were really committed to the city and to sort of, you know, building a culture and building a network together. I think that was something that was exciting that brought me here.
Great. So maybe you could tell everybody a little bit about, it might be hard to see unless you want to take them around, but a lot of your work is focusing on like art historical moments, and it's tied with contemporary pop culture references. So maybe you could show them around your studio and talk a little bit about how you put these images together and your process.
Yeah, absolutely. So if people can see my screen, and I think you can because I set up my laptop as a monitor with another channel open just so I could make sure I didn't screw this up. So a lot of the work that was in the show in Hillyer last year was based around a series of concepts that I've been exploring around the convergence of art historical narratives and our contemporary situation. And this was obviously before, you know, the horror that is our current situation with the coronavirus. But a lot of what I've been thinking about in a lot of my work is environmentalism. And this idea of the human being's effect on the natural world, and this idea that, you know, I studied a lot of art history when I was in school, you know, going back to the classics of Florentine and Renaissance art history. And so there's a lot of structures and a lot of these ideas of like human struggle, the heroic versus the mundane, you know, conflict, man versus man, man versus society, all those good things, right? All this stuff that like we've all learned, but don't seem to learn from. We seem to be able to make these sort of same mistakes over and over again. And so I use references to classical paintings and drawings. This one was based off of a series of Delacroix drawings. And then I bake in different characters. So you'll see, you know, they sort of vacillate between abstraction and figuration. And so you have this sort of pietà figure being cradled by the lion. You know, you have these tigers that may or may not be in repose or, you know, something more dire in this sort of chaotic situation. And so it's a series of very layered representations, very layered references with a kind of poppy color palette. And this goes back to my upbringing in Southern California and being sort of immersed in pop art from a very young age. This idea of like, how do you make something feel both timeless but also extremely present, especially in a world in which we are, you know, bombarded by advertising. And so this takes me to other, you know, interesting territory where I start to explore more ideas of California. And so these obviously are a lot more figurative, or at least a lot more obviously figurative than, you know, pieces like this are. But when people like Kobe Bryant passed away, I was never a big Kobe Bryant fan, to be honest. I grew up with the Magic Johnson, you know, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar era of the Lakers. But I found it really interesting how much it upset me. And to me, it became this sort of very personal narrative about this figure that I never really had a whole lot of interest in, either as a player or as a person, but I was shocked by how upset I was. And so I wanted to unpack that and I wanted to explore that. And so I took a lot of the themes that I was using before. So you'll see things like the serpent gets repeated. You know, obviously the serpent has a very specific connotation for somebody like Kobe Bryant. You know, he was called Mamba. But I wanted to take that as this idea that was permeating a number of the paintings as a sort of biblical reference. And in this case, you know, Kobe's being guarded by LeBron. And I've got this, my great friend Frank Chi is sort of like, man, you put LeBron in there and you don't give him a uniform, you're gonna upset a lot of people. Except for me, he becomes this kind of allegorical figure. That how ironic would it be that if, you know, Bryant wanted to enter the kingdom of heaven as he sort of transitions from a corporeal figure to a more like, you know, heavenly figure in this sort of abstract environment, that he meets LeBron, who has to guard him. And there's all this sort of like pop culture reference to classical art historical tropes of the role of religion in society. But I also just wanted to make something that was fun, because everything that's going on right now is really depressing. And I thought that these paintings would be a great break right now for me mentally, you know, getting away from things like a painting dealing with the wildfires in California, you know, to move into something that was a little bit poppier. So that's a little bit of like how all of that works.
Great.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. No, it's great. Could you maybe, so something that I love as part of my job is going into artist studios and really seeing the process and seeing, smelling the paint and talking to you and meeting your studio dog and all of that. It's really an important component of just working together and getting to know you as an artist. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about like the actual paint you're using, and also something I loved seeing when I did my first studio visit with you. You had all these like references and photos and text and little things like taped up on the wall that you were using as reference to create these different layered paintings. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So ever since I was in art school at the University of Texas at Austin, I have used almost primarily paint made by RGH, Artist Oil Paints. And I hope you guys can see that. It's a family-owned company based out of upstate New York. I have been buying paint from them for the better part of 15, 16, 17 years. It's all handmade, very, very few fillers, if any. Super, super high quality. You get a lot of really great color saturation. You can mix the heck out of this paint. And it's the best made stuff I think I've ever been able to get my hands on. So, not to be too much of a brand fanboy, but like I cannot recommend it enough. And my mentor, Dan Sutherland, turned me on to it, and he uses it, and he's really, really big into color specificity. So as Alison said, reference is extremely important to me. One of the things I teased in my Instagram stories, if you saw it, is what turned me on to what I've been exploring in a lot of this work is the work of Cecily Brown. If you guys are not familiar, a few years ago when the East Wing of the National Gallery reopened, they have a recent acquisitions room. And one of the works that they had in there was Brown's Girl on a Swing. And I saw this painting in person. It was the first Brown that I'd ever seen in person. And it's just like a light bulb went off. And so here's one of the paintings that are based off of that. But like all over my studio, you'll find, like Alison said, books, clippings, I collect things off the internet. I collect a lot of like weird, rare books. This is a great one that my wife got me when she was traveling in England, teaching a class. It's just pictures of elderly people in England dancing from dance classes. Old photographs of Hollywood, I find really fascinating, just as in terms of figures, this idea of like, different sort of California cultures that have persisted over the years and how those cultures get represented. Sports, especially things like skateboarding, surfing, are a big part of the culture that I grew up in. And so I have lots of references to that. Also the environment. This is a photograph of the tsunami coming ashore in Japan that I keep over my desk. And it's a pretty dark image, but I find it really interesting because where the water stopped up against the sloping hillsides in that valley near Fukushima, they found a bunch of stone plinths from hundreds of years before. And those plinths were marked with old Japanese, basically saying, build no lower than this point. And so it goes back to this idea that like even in natural disasters, we as humans don't really seem to learn our lessons very well. And then a lot of like advertising photography, old etchings and engravings. Historically, I've always been interested in the transition from the colonial societies to a sort of more or less post-colonial world, and how those things get represented. I think representation obviously is everywhere right now in the art world, and for good reason. So many people are finding voices that they didn't have before. And so I'm just interested, what is my place in that? What is my place in that dialogue? And what, responsibilities do I have in terms of exploring, sort of where my ancestors come from and our privileged cultures and our effects on the world. And so drawings like this about the slave rebellion in Haiti, it just gives me an opportunity to contemplate and explore what some of those themes might mean in my own work. Works on paper present a lower stakes way of doing that. And so there's a lot of these things that are kind of bouncing around, lots of different levers of content that I'm interested in pulling, but trying to understand how to do that in a responsible way. So, and I have a drawer full of other imagery that's not up on the wall yet. So yeah, there's all kinds of stuff that goes into this.
Great. Before we open it up to questions, I wanted to ask maybe 2 questions of my own and then turn it over. One is, so you have another full-time job, right? Is it with
I
Deloitte?
do.
Deloitte,
Yes.
right? Yeah. So
Yeah, I think I heard somebody earlier mention that we were a sponsor. So
yeah.
in whatever small way, you're welcome.
I'm
trying to keep that money flowing for you guys.
Yeah. I'm wondering about, do you feel like you have more time now? You're still able to get into your studio. Do you feel like you've had more time to be able to work on your paintings, or are you still kind of like balancing what it means to be an artist and having another full-time job separate from the art world?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I love that you asked that question, because it's something that I think, the New York Times did a series on this last year, sort of myth busting this idea that artists, their full-time job has to be their painting or their photography or what have you, that we're not allowed to have, other careers. It's sort of that mythology of being the artist. You're not a successful artist unless you're doing it, all the time, full-time. I am fortunate to have a wonderful career as a creative director. I'm a full-time consultant. I'm a group creative director for Deloitte Digital. During all of this, I'm fortunate to have a studio space that I have access to. It's not too far from the house that I share with my partner, who's a journalist. I will say that I thought I would have more time to do work than I have. The virtual world places a whole other host of time pressures on us. I find myself, I'm no stranger to Zoom. I spend most of my day in and out of Zoom chats, checking in on teams, checking in on projects that are getting done. But, every project that right now that I feel I can successfully deliver, every dollar that I feel I can keep flowing into our studio is another job that I feel like, I could save, even if I had the luxury of walking away from it right now. I don't know if I necessarily would. And it's another creative outlet, but yeah, it definitely gets in the way. But that being said, my Caitlin Genso and I actually share a studio, and her photo workstation is over here. And when she's not here, I use it. And so I have the luxury of getting up and walking over and making some marks if I need to. So it's a balancing act. I'll say that.
Great. So it's a question from Erin. She says, what goes through your mind while you work, especially with the sometimes heavy nature of your subject matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of times I'm having hypothetical conversations, which sounds weird, kind of like I'm talking to myself. I'm not. I'm just sort of like, I think I'm running dialogues through my head about how people might react to what I'm doing, or how people might react, or mentors that I've had might react to a mark that I make. I talked about my mentor from the University of Texas, Dan Sutherland, and another good one was Dan Dove, and they were both painters who relied heavily on this idea of color specificity. And so a lot of times, I find myself when I'm working on something, thinking about Dan's treatise, no, you should never apply the same color in 2 places on the canvas, because if you look at an object, it doesn't have the same 2 colors anywhere. Everything is mixed up. Everything is very specific, and you should always strive for that specificity. So I'm having conversations like that. I listen to a lot of music. I don't listen to a lot of podcasts necessarily while I'm working. I'll listen to NPR and just sort of like in the back of my brain be thinking about what's going on in the world. It is really heavy subject matter, but I enjoy the act and the viscerality of painting so much that I feel like that kind of balances it out for me and keeps it from becoming sort of like emotionally overwhelming.
So I always kind of like to end on like a question that's a light question. And you just mentioned you listen to music. So yeah, what are you listening to, or yesterday was World Book Day. So are you reading anything that's inspiring you or anything like that?
Yeah. So I've been listening to I listen to a lot of jazz when I'm in the studio. So I've been listening most recently to a lot of Thelonious Monk, a lot of other music, a lot of contemporary stuff. Because I used to also be a concert photographer in my spare time when I was in Austin. So I've always been like deeply, deeply interested in music. Book-wise, I think I just started reading some Ursula K. Le Guin. I always read a lot of Joan Didion. Didion's Where I'm From resonates really, really strongly with me because it talks a lot about a very specific part of my childhood and sort of what kind of led to us leaving California. And so I've always found a lot of comfort in reading her work. A lot of Murakami, his sort of magical realism, I've always found really interesting, in this idea of both obvious and not obvious references. I think holds a lot of meaning for me in terms of like the work that I make. So a lot of different stuff. I'm always like bouncing between all kinds of different things. I'm always reading 3 different books, listening to, like a dozen different albums. The Mac Miller posthumous album, I've been listening to that a lot.
Great. All right, so we have a question from Ashley Templeton. Hi, Ashley. Are you taking extra advantage of promoting your work in a creative way on digital platforms? And if so, and which resources are working best? Obviously,
Yeah,
this community meetup is working.
That's a great question. I have the advantage in some ways of always having been relatively business-minded. I was raised by, my mom was an art major, but she also worked professionally in advertising, and so gave me, from a very young age, an education in both things. So self-promotion isn't, while I have the gift of gab, it isn't always the most comfortable thing for me, but professionally, I learned the value of things like social media as it emerged. And so I use Instagram a lot. I've found Instagram, sharing my work on a regular basis, trying not to overshare, keeping myself to sort of a content calendar, sharing a post maybe once or twice a week, sharing stories on a regular basis to keep people engaged. I found that in the run up to the show at Hillyer, so many people came up to me that were like, oh my God, I've been following along. I really wanted to see this work in person. And I thought that was really interesting. It can feel really performative. And so you have to be careful, depending on you personally, whether that impacts your work. Sometimes I'll share, me like making a mark, but I try not to too much because I don't want that to influence my decision-making as a painter. But I will share lots of stuff in progress because I think it's just fun for people to be able to see that and to be able to see how work gets made. I mean, it's one of the magic opportunities and one of the bonuses of what, can be more problematic aspects of social media, is that you get a window into worlds that maybe you never got to see before. And if, that can also provide people that maybe didn't have a template for how to be an artist, it can provide them a template with like, how does this get made? It wasn't until I saw Brown in person that I understood how Brown constructed her paintings. If there's people that are, people will reach out to me I just had somebody reach out to me from Portugal asking about my process. And so I shared a couple of videos with them of like how I made marks and how I used things like rubber scrapers. As Jeff Wall said on a great episode of Art 21, references are no secrets, they're the condition of the work. So I think social media, anything and everything that you can use it, just try it. I think there's no right or wrong channels.
Before I know that we're coming up on our time here, I see Nicole there. I just wanted to, in addition to that, you're represented by Caitlin Berry Fine Art, and I know that
Yes.
She just launched a new Artsy page featuring your work. So obviously people can reach out to you through your Instagram and your website very easily, but if they want to see more of your work or talk more about that or purchase one of your pieces, I know that you can check out the new Artsy page, which is great. And Kristen Caps wants to know, I think it's Kristen Caps wants to know, Showtime Lakers or Jordan era Bulls?
What was the first one?
Showtime Lakers or Jordan era Bulls?
Oh, that's tough. Showtime era Lakers.
Right.
I always got to bring it back to LA.
Okay.
In Angelino in exile.
Okay. All right. Well, that's it. Thank you so much for joining us, Eric, and we can turn it back over to Nicole.